I'd like to welcome everybody to the Native American Heritage Month Roundtable. And before we get started, since we are all right now on native land, and we'll always be on native lands as far as I'm concerned, as Panelist is concerned, I believe, we like to start this off as we always do in a traditional manner, and that's with the opening prayer. And I would like to ask our sister from Hawaii, Mikila Allah, to begin with opening prayer, please.
Oga peli gaya ko givae gai goyala. E pa mai da uavo mai ayo nuia ina. E la kue la ule apue kaya o kakone. E gipa mai enane amai ike yaku. E aloha e aloha la, e aloha e. Velina mai kaku, aloha.
Aho, Mahaza Gidas, thank you very much. Again, welcome everybody. I think this is a very exciting panel we have. Before I introduce myself a little bit, I'd like to go over the overview a little bit. This year, the National Park Service and the United States Public Health Service are celebrating their centennial partnerships to protect, promote, and advance health in parks. As part of this celebration, the National Park Service Office of Public Health and the National Environmental Education Foundation are hosting the 4th installment of the Power of Parks for Health Roundtable series. Today, we will center our discussions on the theme of invisibility and highlight the experience of Native communities in connection to health and the outdoors. Please note that this webinar will be recorded as well. Before we get started with our this evening's discussion, I have a few ground rules to cover with everybody. This is a platform for us to generate discussion and dialogue. We may face some tough questions, and I really hope we do. And our panelists may share experiences that are strikingly different than your opinions, your experiences, or your knowledge. Keep an open mind and remember, our panelists are sharing their own personal experiences and knowledge. Be respectful and mind your comments to the chat. Hate speech and disrespectful language will not be tolerated and may result in your removal. We have a lot to cover with only 90 minutes to share. Unfortunately, we may not have time to get your specific questions. We will follow up with you by email with a list of resources and recording of this webinar. Let me introduce myself before we get going. My name is Gerard Baker, and I'm a proud member, a full-blood member of the Mandan Hedadza tribal group in Fort Bristol Reservation in North Dakota. I grew up in a very traditional household and with the first generation to be, had the opportunity to be born outside of our beautiful valley of the Missouri River because they dammed it up on us. So I grew up in a household of very much tradition. When I was very young, we had no running water and no electricity, but we were very close, a very close-knit family. And it was here that I started learning, without even knowing I was learning, about the National Park Service and about how these parks were on native land and will always be on native land, including ours as the Mandan Hedadza tribe. And so it's very important to understand, I spent 36 years in the National Park Service. And my first job, as I tell people, I always love to tell the story because my first job was cleaning toilets at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And as I tell people, I then worked my way down to management from there. And so I've had 36 years in National Park Service, 36 years of hoping to try to educate people from the Native American perspective when it comes to the idea of parks, when it comes to the idea of spirituality in those parks, and when it comes to the idea of respecting the land and helping to understand who we are as people. We have a great panel tonight. We have 4 phenomenal leaders to engage in this rich discussion. And I would like to introduce our panelists, beginning with our sister, the one that said the prayer. And I'm going to ask her to help me because I speak a little bit Hiraza, but I sure don't speak Hawaiian. So I'm going to ask her to help me. So if you can introduce, before I mess up, introduce yourself, your park, and a little bit about yourself.
Velina mai kako. My name is Mikiala Peskaya, Native Hawaiian, born and raised on the island of Molokai, where my park, Kalaupapa National Historical Park, is located. Tiny island, 11 miles by 38 miles, population of just under 7,000, around 7,000, and mostly Native Hawaiian. And so it's a privilege to be a part of the National Park Service and representing my community, my people, my ancestors in this space.
Great, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Jacqueline Russell. Jacqueline, if you again can introduce yourself, please, and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, everyone, for the invitation to be here with you all. And it's so exciting to see all those numbers, like people populating and chiming in. I'm connecting from the lands of the Samoyama people. These are the homelands of my partner's community. And I'm really grateful for these lands as they continue to teach me many things, including how to be a mother to my 2 beautiful children. And it's wonderful to be nourished by these lands and the river that's near us here, the Rio Grande. And the way that they feed, all of these energies feed me away from my home, which are in the northeastern part of Arizona. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation, and I'm joining here wearing many different hats, but really bringing my love for the power of culture with me as the Director of Decolonized Futures and Radical Dreams at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, where I am one of a couple stewards of the Honor Native Land Project, which really promotes and shares the importance of engaging in the practice of land acknowledgement as a way to move toward collective liberation and the fulfillment of Indigenous sovereignty. So wonderful to be with you all.
Thank you very much. Great panelists. Again, we have great panels put together. Now there's some themes as we go on tonight's discussion. There's some themes that we'd like to have you keep in mind, folks, as we go through this. Some of the themes to consider about with the discussions tonight are invisibility, and you really see that, I think, in a lot of national parks. A lot of national parks. I worked for the National Park Service, like I said, for 36 years. And when I first started, there weren't that many American Indians and other natives, Hawaiians and the folks from up north. It seemed like on management staff. We had a lot of folks that were in positions of maintenance, which was great, care for the grounds, which was great, but not many in management. And so as far as I'm concerned, we were very invisible at that time, and to a certain extent, maybe still are. Another theme that we will consider tonight, or as we go about this, is the historical present barriers to access. And I know access is a huge challenge right now, because a lot of us, they expect us to, from an accessibility standpoint, even pay to get into our homelands. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about that in the past, and maybe that will come up tonight again. And another major theme is with the living and breathing cultures. And that is to bring more of our culture into the management, into interpretation, into the natural resources, basically into the national parks and other agencies that you're working with. and there's ways to do that. We're going to get to the questions now, and we'll go right down the line, folks. And so the first question I offer, which will
Gerard.
Yes, go ahead.
Hey, this is Ty. I'm getting nudged by some of the other people on here and introduce myself. And
I forgot.
Yeah, you got on that piece on invisibility, and then I got caught in that piece. So
I'm sorry. I went right by you. I went right down my line here. So, okay, Ty, go ahead.
Right now. Inimunayma inknash waniksha winch ilch qualtifla say nich pachwai to each and every one of you. I just want to say greetings. You know, my name's Ty Smith. I am too a proud member of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon. I come to you today though from my second home out here in Ohio. And I live out here with my family. I've raised 3 children with my wife. I'm the project director of the Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio, or we just say NACO for short, because the Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio is quite a mouthful. But, you know, glad to be here today. You know, I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. And just wanted to, insert myself a little bit here, Gerard. Didn't mean to interrupt you, you know. Want to respect you as an elder, and you know, just glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to pass it back to you, Gerard.
All right, thank you very much, Ty. And again, as an elder, you understand how we kind of get scatterbrained once in a while. And
Yep, all the responsibilities.
So we're back at it again. So I appreciate you, Ty.
Yep.
Okay, the first question we're going to go with, folks, and we'll go right down the line. And the first question is related to history and barriers. The first question is this: what are some of the historical barriers to accessing the outdoors, and have you experienced them? Have you been impacted by them? So we'll start with Michaela.
Oh, this is an interesting question. I think first off, for us, it's the way we consider outdoors. Like the outdoors is a collection of all of our ancestors. It's our deities, it's our gods, our akua, and our guardians. And so being outdoors is really just us hanging out with our family. And sustenance activities, like a lot of our activities were intentional and very thoughtful and mindful. And there's this transition with other people coming in that their interaction with the outdoors is more recreational because they already have sustenance, and you know, they have those things provided for them, and they share this space with us already with a different view and a different respect. And so when the people managing these spaces, like government entities and, you know, these other landowners, up until 1848, nobody owned land in Hawaii. The kingdom still established that it was a stewardship relationship. And so the outdoors, we were all caretakers, caretakers of the outdoor space. And so just that transition in thought, it's pretty new to us. It's only 170 years old, you know, where like we had to shift the mindset of what being outdoors is. And so today, while we're trying to continue to engage in these activities, similar activities are actually in 2 different categories. So we fish to eat and other people fish for fun. And when they're interacting in this outdoor space, how do you make regulations or rules, you know, that sort of protect the fun interaction from impeding the more life sustaining activities? And that's where a lot of our conflict comes in, because who has, quote, rights to these spaces, who has authority over these spaces, and in trying to be fair and find that common ground to protect these spaces for everyone, it usually means we have to compromise a bit of ourselves. And when we have to compromise, you know, compromising recreation is one thing, but compromising our livelihood, that's where the friction comes in, right? Because that's not something that we can negotiate. And so the barriers have come from this idea that everybody has rights to things, but not everyone has a responsibility. And responsibility is to the collective. And for us, it's to our ancestors who are keeping us accountable for the management, the relationship that the community has with these spaces. I'm going to start off with that thought.
Oh,
Anybody
great.
have anything they want to add to that? Or is that the case for you, Jacqueline or Ty, like in your communities? Do you have the same sort of sentiment maybe or understanding?
Yeah, Nikki, Ella, I so appreciate just there was so much richness in like your response. And I think like the question really is two-pronged, right? When I think about my upbringing, I grew up in rural northeastern Arizona. We were always outside, like, and my partner and I talk about that now, where I'm like, it was just like, that was what we did. Like, we were always dirty from our mother's perspectives of like, whether we were muddy or whether we were like wet from being in the ditch and the washes that we were near our homes, to just being sandy, right? Like, there was just like so much our experience of being in our land as like two res kids, like, was very much like being in the outdoors. And the way that I engaged in my culture as somebody who was like fortunate enough and privileged enough to be one, it's not the experience today, even though like I'm almost 40, I grew up on my reservation. And today, like in my community, over half of our community lives off the reservations for economic reasons, for love, for all different kinds of like all reasons of the diaspora, right? Like are living out of their communities, are living out of our communities. And so our experiences are really different. And our access to the outdoors is different depending on those areas. And that I've had both of that in my life as a res kid growing up, and then moving to so-called Phoenix, Arizona, and living in O'odham lands, and really yearning for like that time outdoors, right? And then it was through like meeting O'odham friends and different people who were desert people who showed me like different trails and taught me names of their mountains, that I began to like experience urban hiking. So more of that recreational kind of aspect, which was very different from like where I was from. But then I think when we think about it from the perspective of like parks, I came from a family that did have access to the to parks, to being able to travel and having time to vacation to places to have experiences like that, because my parents like did both have like a freelance job, and then my mom was a teacher. So there was like a regular like cash flow for us to be able to experience that, which is also something that I recognize as a privilege, and is not something that just from a socioeconomic perspective internally within some families, and I would say maybe most Indigenous families, that experiencing like other Indigenous communities, homelands, through like the national park systems is not always accessible. Which I know we'll get into later, but it just like there's such a rich conversation. I'd love to hear what Ty's thoughts are like on this too.
Thanks, ladies. Really nice to listen to the both of you. Mickey Ayla, did I say it right? I hope I did. Yeah, okay. Jacqueline, thank you guys, both of you. You guys really are kind of just I don't know, striking on a really nice chord to get things going here, because I just got back from Oregon, and I grew up there, and the question, I wrote it down: barriers to accessing the outdoors. And I remember, growing up and early on, I noticed that it felt like the sky was the limit, I guess. I didn't know that there were limitations out there, and meaning when I first was really just kind of being introduced to the outdoors, it was by way of hunting. It was by way of cutting wood, fishing, root digging, gathering berries. And I've got real familiar with these different places through my family, and through my mom and my dad and my brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, all of them, and we did it as a family. And you didn't begin to think that there were rules and regulations and laws and restrictions and things like that in place. And for us, our reservation is 650,000 plus acres. And I didn't know what fences meant. I didn't understand what fences meant, you know, because we could walk through any one fence at any point in time. But as I began to get a little bit older, and as I began to really understand that there's more to the world than just what, you know, takes place in Warm Springs, Oregon, that, you know, there's rules and regulations, and there's hunting seasons, and there's restrictions, and there's places you cannot go, and, you know, this place is out of bounds, and this is off your reservation, and guess what, there's a whole new set of rules going on out here. And when I began to grasp that, it really started to I guess kind of make me wonder, like, well, why is this, and what is this about? But then I began to appreciate this whole the conservation side of it, the preservation side of it, you know, and wanting to, you know, keep these things, you know, in such a state that we weren't, you know, depleting them and destroying them and driving them into the ground, you know, hence, you know, a lot of what has been done, you know, over the years, regardless. But I mean, to slow that process and at least try to do as much as we can. And so I began to appreciate the work. And my dad, you know, he was a fish and wildlife officer as well on our reservation. And so I really began to look at that and say, wow, you know, what you're doing, Dad, that's some really awesome stuff. And, you know, and sometimes he would be, you know, we say, Chiapo is the white people, he would be busting them, but sometimes he would be busting some of our own too. You know, he had to, you know, kind of keep people in check, but, you know, it was for the right reasons. And I grew to appreciate that. And, you know, I've kind of like you're saying, Jacqueline, you know, you're in Phoenix and we're out here in Ohio. And first half of my life, I grew up on the reservation. You know, I was a res kid, and, you know, I was just like you said, you know, you're dirty and you're playing and you're running about and doing your thing. And, you know, my wife as well, we're both from there. And we came out to Ohio, and now we're seeing things through a different lens. And we've basically have lived our second half of our lives raising children and even stepping into grandparenthood now out here in Ohio. And it's a really different take on things, especially when it comes to accessing the outdoors, connecting with place, and being able to make that association. And in all honesty, there's a new heartfelt concern and care for what it means to be urban, you know, Native American. Because a lot of these people out here, you know, and I'm not trying to set them off to the side and categorize them. These are the people that we work with, we represent, you know, we care for, love, and call family. But many of them have, you know, there's been a certain disconnect that we've noticed in terms of what's been their background and how they've been raised and what they've come to know in terms of who they are, compared to those of us that really lived amongst our people and practice our ways and learn these things since early on. And it's quite a challenge, and especially in a state like Ohio. You know, I'll spotlight Ohio here for a second, but there's no infrastructure in place out here. You see zero in terms of what would be labeled Native American, you know, resources, infrastructure, anything like that. No reservations, no BIA, IHS, anything like that. Our one and only little urban Indian center in NACO is the only viable urban Indian center in the state. But very tall order at times. Our work, you know, extends to all corners of the state, but, you know, it's something we're up for the task for. But in all of this, though, we've come to recognize that, man, when we can take our people out and about and make those opportunities available to them, it's powerful. You could see that side of them wake up, you know, that blood memory, that DNA part of them that knows who they are, you know, and it's inquisitive and wants to know more and wants to connect and be a part of all of that, and doing it by way of community too, not just individualized, you know, working, you know, with the ideology of our people, our traditions, our culture, our ways. But anyway, barriers, yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing, you know, especially when we have to navigate the pathways that we have to deal with out here. And in Ohio, for us, the challenge too becomes invisibility, because in the recent census, we make up 0.3% of the population in this state. So we're less than 0.5% of the people out here. So we really have to learn how to navigate and walk in balance, with both worlds simultaneously. And it does become very tricky at times. And I'm going to say about that much. I really like this question. There's probably a lot more that I would like to unpack here. I think that other questions to come are going to allow us to speak further to that. So I'm going to go ahead and just end my piece right there, Gerard, and I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ty, Michaela, and Jacqueline. Great answers. And yes, they will come back. I want to tell everybody also, if you have questions, please use the question and answer box. And there's going to be a lot of questions that we may not get to, but like Ty said, it gives us an opportunity to create a dialogue for the future, to open it up, to make sure that this conversation does not just end tonight, but continues. And I know we're talking about Native American Month. As I said before, I'm a firm believer that, Native American Month is every month of the year. And as long as we remember that and our visitors remember that. The second question I have, folks, is how do you think people should view nature, the land, the parks, and the public space? Michaela, we'll start with you again.
Well, I kind of touched on that in the first. I'm going to play off of Ty's last comment because I think that's a really important point or area of concern maybe is that it's our own people. The evidence of or the effects of colonization really has divided us. And the other thing is that a lot of us are mixed ancestry. I saw someone pop up in the chat about census statistics and about sort of the divide between pure-blooded indigenous versus, people of mixed cultures and ethnicities and blood quantums now. And a lot of our programs are sort of in trying to right the wrongs. A lot of our programs are, targeting, and we're trying to use these metrics to bring equity into spaces. So that's one thing that I think, even for Hawaii, we struggle with that all the time. We have a line of what is Native Hawaiian, 50% blood quantum. You guys get access to these resources. And then if you're less, you can access it only if the 50% people bequeath it to the 25%. It just gets really, really, it creates animosity and it creates trauma all over again because in China, like the have and have nots and how much is enough. And we've got people with blood quantums who don't have the connection culturally. They're not the practitioners. They're not the ones living by the spirit and the nature and have the relationships. So it forces us to consider what is most important in keeping a people's alive. Is it the blood or is it the practice? For us, it's both. The genealogy is your inherent mana, and then each of us has a responsibility of acquired mana and the things you do in your lifetime that bring you closer to the rights and privileges and responsibilities that all come together. We have one word for it, it's kuleana. Rights, responsibilities, and privilege is all the same word for us because you can't have one without the other. And so as peoples, when we're engaging in these relationships with nature, how you view nature, it's not, it's the truth. There's so many of us who are influenced by media, by just the communities we live in, the economics in the situations we find. Jacqueline mentioned, we leave our tribe, we leave our spaces in pursuit of education, employment, love, all of these things. And they're all really important to every single one of us. We should be, feel free to pursue those things. But how do we take our culture with us? And how do we create spaces for people to still be them and hold that identity? And the truth is, like, you're always going to have to answer to the majority. For me, on my island, we're 70% Hawaiian. So we're still the majority on my island. And at my park, what is really cool is in our enacting legislation, it says that after the veteran preference, Native Hawaiians will receive preference in our hiring. It's because we are on tribal land, on homestead land. So Department of Interior also administers the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. And because part of our park is on Hawaiian homelands, we have this obligation to hire Hawaiians. And so we take full advantage of that. But I don't want to hire Hawaiians into this job just because you're Hawaiian. I want you to be the best person for the job. So that's where working with our colleges, our university, and training up people. Today, I'm proud to say that we have, I believe, of the 42 people on staff, 34 of them are Native Hawaiian. I want to be in charge, and I want, to be surrounded by people who have not just the privilege, and the responsibility, but have this, have a voice. But you got to find the way. Like, we cannot just stand here and say we don't have a voice, we don't have it. You got to find the way to be heard. And so for me, it was joining the Park Service and creating opportunity for other Hawaiians to be heard and be amplified. And look, I'm here in this conversation with all of you. 5 years ago, I don't think I would have even imagined this conversation happening, not for the Park Service, and so these are exciting times. The outdoors, again, it's about relationship. And as we continue to create opportunity from the inside out for our people to be welcomed into these spaces and to bring those practices, it's use it or lose it, basically, right? Use it or lose it. If we don't create opportunity and we don't maintain those relationships and we don't continue to show our people, reactivate the things in their DNA, that's our fault. So I'm sure this is happening in all of your places too. Jacqueline, Ty, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, again, just like so much. I think, in terms of like the idea of like, how do I think people should view like the outdoors, nature, the world around us? Like, my consultancy and like my life's work is really to educate from the perspective of sharing our Indigenous teachings and our Indigenous knowledge, like as being the center, and like the center as something that's like emanating, not necessarily center of like holding power from a colonial perspective of center, but really from this emanation of like power and medicine and like wholeness. And I was taught like several different philosophies, and Miki'ala, I just thank you for like naming and bringing in like your language, like in just from the beginning, right? From the start of these words that really we could have probably 20 different Zoom sessions and not come to like a full understanding, right? Like, we can look at elders in our communities and spend time with each of them in study, in relationship with them, trying to learn about these philosophies. And for Diné people, there are kind of 3 guiding stars that like I work from on a daily basis. The first is K'eh, and K'eh is our word for in English, the simplified way of saying it would be like kinship and like relationality, but it's really that the way that we understand our responsibility to each other, not just as Bala'ashla'i, as 5-fingered people, but really as all living beings in this world. So we recognize that like the trees and the rocks and the earth and the air and the water are all powerful and have their own energy, right? And so K'eh is being in kinship and relationship with all of those things, right? And I move in the world with understanding K'eh, but also understanding Honjo. And Honjo is also this holistic philosophy of being in harmony with all of those things. How are we regenerating? How are we giving back into those energies and places and those living beings around us, and paying respect to those things in our actions, in our prayers. And then the other teaching, which is also really an epistemology, which is Sa'ana Gab Ehonjo, which teaches us everything about life. It includes like our mountains as being teachers, of having lessons and sharing life cycles, for the like feminine energy and the masculine energy. It is all of those things. And so when we look at where we're at in this world and in this planet right now, right, we know that there have been huge disruptions and disconnects to be at this brink of just massive change, like in our world, right? And so I think that so much of this idea of like, how should we view nature, and this understanding is that we are equal, and in a lot of sense, like we have to be humble, like as Blaashlight people, like we are so, like our time with this female Nahazan Nehema of our Earth Mom is so short compared to all the living things and like the lineages of people who have and will have relationship with her, right? Is so, just so rich. And that I think what can be grounding for us all as Blaashlight people is to recognize that we are indigenous to some place, right? That if we think about and study our understanding of the world around us, of our place, you know, some of those who are listening, you know, we're brought here, you know, to be slaves, and we continue to ignore that, right? We continue to ignore the fact that like the lands that we're on, whether you're visiting a national park or have plans to visit a park, like that's all indigenous land. And there's been strategic ways that medicine and that nature has been disrupted, right? And the relationship and the stewardship that indigenous people have carried for so long have been thwarted. Like that was all strategy. And so I think when I think about this idea of like, how should we view nature? Like it really is like, how do we begin relationship? How do we restore our relationship? And I know that even as an indigenous person, I can't look at my life for these past like 38 years and know that everything I did has been like, every action has been in service like of Mother Earth. Because like I've ordered from Amazon, I've depleted things, like I've not offset carbon emissions, like I've harmed, right? Like I've created harm, but like being able to hold that together and think about this possibility, like how do we move from this place of being in this position of power and the possibilities of being able to make the best decisions I can now for all the people who are going to continue, all the life, not just people, the life that will continue here. And so I think like all of that is really something I've been thinking about a lot, especially now. And like we're looking at the COP26 that's happening right now in Glasgow. I think there's just so much that has been on my mind about this like future forward thinking and indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. So I'll hand it over to Ty. There's so many juicy questions.
You can keep going, Jacqueline, if you want. You're on a roll there. So many things, yeah, to discuss here. And, you know, even the question in itself, how do you think, you know, and then to try to answer that, you know, right away, I'm thinking, well, my point of view is I guess my point of view, and not to try to impose or, you know, demand that any one certain way be thought of. And, you know, I kind of reflect on the fact that, you know, having lived in Ohio for, you know, the past 25 plus years, I've been distant from home, but I've sought to stay connected as much as possible. And I travel back there, you know, at least once or twice a year. And like I said, I just came back from Oregon. And you know, when I go back there, there's so many things that I'm reminded of, you know, as I'm walking the lands there, and I was able to go out fishing and, you know, gathering a little bit stuff here and there too, medicines with my dad and moving around, and just recalling, you know, that those times and those memories that we had together from when I was a kid, and you know, listening to his stories when he was a kid, and then recalling, you know, what it must have been like, you know, and then going back into his father, my grandfather, and then his father, my great grandfather, and listening to those stories and what they were talking about. And amongst our people, and I'm really glad that both Michaela and Jacqueline, you guys, spoke to the things that are important in terms of the real foundation of what your culture is based upon. And sometimes I get people, they come up to me, and in Ohio, it's kind of interesting at times. Sometimes Native people are treated as if there were some sort of novelty or some throwback from the past, or some antique that's been found, and like just wow, what can you wow us with, and I have to sit there and I have to pay attention to what my words are, because I know that sometimes first impressions are very powerful, and I got to be careful to make sure that I'm honoring who I am, who I speak on behalf of, and where I come from, and to remain humble. And I'm glad you guys used those types of words earlier, to think in that light. When I recall certain parts of my identity, I begin to start. I try to stop and to think and understand that when they were talking about, and when they shared the first stories with us about creation and the origin of our people and how that all came about, and we live in a very predominantly Christian-based society, and amongst the Christians, and not to take away or to start any sort of religious type of debate here of any sort, but I'm just saying that it's easy to reference to them, because it's very, very much understood by people that when you reference to the Bible, and to a Christian, that all stands to be as what it is. And it's the same with us. But unfortunately, our stories are kind of out of sight, out of mind, and they're not mainstream. And we have to think on those things. And when I recall what I've learned over my lifetime, and it's not to say that by any means I have it all down either. I mean, I feel like I'm constantly always trying to be a student. And even if I think I have it down, I'm probably going to get humbled in some way, shape, or form. But in our creation story, it speaks to our people, and we're referred to as the river people, those that lived along the Columbia River. And our people originally came similar to other tribes from above, from the star people, from our star relatives above, and they came down, and they so brought these children into this world, and so called this place home. But in doing so, in that origin, they were concerned in leaving them here, and what was going to take place and what was going to happen to them after they were left by themselves. And so they called unto the world, and they asked, who will help our children here? Who will watch over them and take care of them? And in our early stories, you hear of the salmon, you hear of the elk, you hear of the deer, you hear of the roots, the berries, the different medicines. They spoke up. And in a time when there was a spiritual language, they say, and they were able to understand, and they all came forward and said that we will give of ourselves so that the lives of your children can be fulfilled in this world. But in turn, it was acknowledged by the human being, by man, by Tanan, our people, the native people, that we would take care of these things. And it was a give and take, and there was no sense of a greed or of power or anything like that. It was to be in balance. And I've been able to compare that to a lot of other tribes' worldviews over the years. And it's been really interesting to be in Ohio, because it's a very intertribal setting out here. And there's a lot of Dene, there's a lot of Lakota, Dakota, Ojibwe people. I really connected, though, very well with a lot of my Northern Plains relatives, Dakota, Lakota, Cheyenne. And to listen to the way that they define the medicine wheel and mitake wasen, and all of life is together, and you begin to start to think and this question here, how should we view nature? And I really like in its simplicity that nature has always been the way that nature is going to be, and it's us who have changed and stepped away from that instruction. And so I think, what our teachings really were showing early on, and they weren't even it was just an understanding that was known that the knowledge, the wisdom, the educator was Mother Earth, was nature around us. And so we paid attention to that. And kind of going up into your area, Gerard, was fortunate enough to take a youth group up there to the Fort Peck Reservation. And they showed us around and they took us out to their buffalo farm. And I was amazed at how much land they had fenced off and designated for those buffalo. And when we approached them, we came in on a truck and a van. And early on, we approached this bull and he got up and he began to show his presence and make his presence known. And then we drove maybe a quarter mile around here. Then there was another bull. Then we came to, and he stood up. Then we came up to this kind of high point. And the one that was guiding us, this woman, she pointed out, she goes, look across this whole valley here. And she pointed out these bulls and they were surrounding the Teoshpe, their people, right? And within was the mothers and the grandmothers and the children and the warriors. And so as it was explained is that's how their camps were set up. And that's the way they looked at things. And I've noticed these different teachings and amongst the Lakota in the same way that you talk about the three deities of your people, Jacqueline, in the same way they look to the star relatives in that way. And that's how they chose, and that's how they arranged the three main points of their teepees. And when they structure it, they stand it to the morning star, the evening star, and to the north star, like that. And so these things are, you know, there's a play in all of it too. And they talk about a time when they knew how to put these teepees up even in a real way, that they didn't have to worry about a tornado because they were aligning it with the natural ways and the natural laws of this world. So in my way, and I just am very humble, not to try to impose, but you know, I think nature's always been our teacher. We just have to learn how to turn our ears back on. So I'll say about that much right now.
Oh, thank you very much, Ty, Michaela, Jacqueline, that was great. With that thought in mind, you know, I come from a generation when I was very young. Like I said, we just got removed from our beautiful bottomlands and the government dammed us out. And we had to go up on top of on the high bluffs area with rocks and so forth. And at that time, the old people that I grew up with would be telling us, you know, they would warn us. They would tell us all these stories about what you guys are talking about, the sky people and the creators and our clans and societies. But they would always tell us with the thought afterwards, and they would say, you know, whatever you do, don't tell the white people. You know, let them, don't tell them, because I think the reason they said that is because, you know, my mom and dad, you know, my mom especially couldn't speak English that well when she was very young. She didn't learn until she was 15 years of age. And my dad was about the same. He was a Mandan and my mother was a Hidatsa, and they both experienced those really rugged boarding schools. And I got to go to boarding school as well, as a Catholic boarding school. That's all I'm going to say about that. And so with those thoughts in mind, when I got into the Park Service, it was really hard for a long time to talk about our cultures, to talk about who we were as people, even to mention about the spirituality of those living beings that we call the rocks and the trees and the streams and so forth. And now we're starting to seem like we're doing that. So my question now to you is, with all this in mind, how do we take that one step farther? How do we now take it into management? And of all the management programs I've been in my years as being various superintendents all over the place, years of working with different tribes, I worked with 28 different tribes with Lewis and Clark. You know, we brought it in there, obviously. But how do you bring it into a National Park Service management team and to make sure it's there all the time? And any thoughts on that, please?
Ooh, my spot is a little tricky. So my park, Kalaupapa National Historical Park, I guess the significant historical story is one of Hansen's disease, and a law that was passed by a king who, in hopes of preserving his diminishing Native Hawaiian population and to protect the spread of this disease and the decimation of his peoples, implemented a quarantine program, a law that basically said if you were infected, you will be forcibly removed and sent in exile. And that was out of aloha and compassion for the rest of the people he was trying to protect. But in that act, it created this divide. It tore families apart. Because for us, no matter what's happening to the tribe, right, to the family, everyone sticks together. We face it together. And so when you started to break apart the structure, because if you think about it, well, for us, our whole kingdom, it starts off with the small. You have self, you have your family, then you have your kauhale, like the people who live in your household. Then all our land divisions go out from there. Ili, ahupua'a, moku, and it's these people work together with these people who work together with these people, and we viewed our resources and our responsibilities in this very collective way, but also recognizing the part you play. When you start pulling people out, and again, that's a Western response. That's not something we normally would have done, but that's a Western response to a Western introduced challenge. We didn't know what to do. We've tried everything in our indigenous ways, in our local ways, and it wasn't helping. And so we suffer from the trauma of that. Yeah. Now, generationally, the disconnect. There's so much disconnect. It's actually one of the names for Hansen's disease or leprosy in Hawaiian is ma'iho o ka'awale, which means the separating sickness, because it separated us from our homelands, separated us from our family, from our practices. People couldn't continue their cultural practices because they physically or emotionally were not able to engage. They had to rebuild this community. So our park, it was invited, National Park Service was invited into this space because after 103 years of this law, finally we had a cure. It took 103 years for us to halt this disease and get our people back into a safe, healthy space. But the damage has already been done. And now the remaining patients, we still have a community of people who once suffered from this disease. They no longer are contagious, no longer, but they're former patients. But they're also were afforded a space where because they couldn't reconnect, they were shunned from their families or they had nothing to go back to. We've preserved Kalaupapa as a safe haven for them until their last breath. That if they want to remain here in Kalaupapa, they could. If they had somewhere to go and wanted to, they could walk away from this title and this categorization. It's kind of this trippy thing when you think about it, like, who are we, our identity? When we're labeled something and it stays with us, there's some things that will never change, right? There's some things that we can change. Our genealogy, we can't change that. We are who we are. I'm Hawaiian. I can't change that I'm Hawaiian. I could be stuck being Hawaiian forever. That's a blessing. But I can change. I'm a mother. I gave birth. I will never be able to change that. Even if my children are taken away, I will forever be a mother. But there are other things that they didn't want those labels anymore. They didn't want to be known as someone, a patient. They wanted to be known as an amazing fisherman and provider and an honest person, hard worker, every other title except for that one. And so I think even just that conversation of identity, who are we? And those identities come with expectations and entitlements, I think, sometimes. So because I'm Hawaiian, I might feel entitled to a certain to access or to privileges and rights, right? That other people who don't have that shared perspective or privilege might feel like that's not fair. And they don't know where the fairness, how do we measure fairness in American perspective? Everybody is equal. And then in our cultural perspective, you have nothing, you have to work and earn it. If you don't earn it, the ancestors might just decide you shall starve and none of your plants will grow and the rain will not fall. And if, and we look at those things like, everything happens in our environment is a direct result of our own actions. And so when we try to hold not just ourselves accountable, but other people around us accountable, and we're trying to inspire this collective balance with the energies of the universe and the energies of nature around us, we are met with resistance often. Often. And probably the biggest struggle is with our own people. Like reconciling, so you've got, like, especially for us on my island, like I've got people who are still working through the traumas of all the injustices happened to them, and they can't get past the hurt. And so I have to honor that hurt that they carry. I honor it. And I try to get them into a place of productivity and moving forward and reconciliation. I'm not saying you have to forgive. I'm not saying you have to, but I'm saying that it is taking up a huge chunk of your energy, space, and time holding that grudge. How can we move past those things so that we can get back to living and thriving again? Because if they take that joy away from you, you're being re-victimized all over again. And you're getting re-victimized for the things that happened to your grandparents and your parents, and now you. Don't let them take that joy away from you. Don't let history take that away from you when you have future and present in your hands. So what can we do to re-engage in these spaces? Yes, those things all happened right here. Now, what can we learn from it? How can we teach our children to do better? And what are the legacies that we can leave them, where we honor and put these things into perspective, but we, instead of carrying the hurt, we use that as inspiration of reconnection. And so, you know, like in this context of Hansen's disease, yes, I honor the fact that we went through this trial, and it really hurt, especially now with pandemic. COVID-19 is transmitted the same way as Hansen's. Like, we are back into, we are living 50 years ago. Like, our rules and regulations in our park, we're close to the public, we're considered a healthcare facility because we have elders who were alive in that first time. We're re-traumatizing them again because we're back to where we cannot touch them. We have to keep our distance. And I cannot tell you what it feels like to stand there and know that we're part of their community, and they're in their 90s and all they spent a chunk of their life being untouchable. And then we work to undo that. And then now we're back to it, but it's the opposite. They were a threat to our safety, and now we're a threat to theirs. We don't want to put them at risk. But they have a hard time understanding that, because it's setting them back to this trauma of not feeling that compassion, not feeling that aloha. And now this whole conversation of what is liberty and what are rights. If that kupuna, that 90-year-old auntie elder is saying to me, I don't care, I need a hug me, come and hug me. And she said, I survived cancer, I survived Hansen's, I've survived depression, I've survived world wars. Like, she's like, I survived all of this. And if it's my time to go, yeah, if Akua, it's my time to go, then it's my time to go. Who gets to tell me who I get to hug? But it's a liability, right? The Department of Health, the National Parks, everybody doesn't want to assume that liability, because if something were to happen, it doesn't matter what she says, it's going to be our fault. We're going to receive a blame. So it's an example of how do we reconcile and sort of weigh out what are the things that as humans, as Indigenous people, and then in the roles that we serve, what are the priorities? Like, what supersedes what in that space? You know, when an elder says, just hug me, I want to be hugged, what do you do, right? Arrowhead says, no, this is the policy, right? Your heart, your ancestors are saying, what's wrong with you? Why do you not listen? Why do you not go? Why do you not, right? That creates internal struggle for us. I just shared one of the challenges that we've had working through pandemic today, looking at history and then having it happen all over again and being a part of that, and owning the accountability, who I answer to in that space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jacqueline?
So I think that, yeah, just again, appreciation, Michaela, for sharing so much wisdom and medicine and just things that I'll keep thinking about after we close our session. I think that this idea of like equality and equity is something that continually gets misunderstood, miscommunicated. And we as Indigenous people know that in many cases we don't have either, right? Like we don't have equity and we don't have equality. And so I think like we have, to me, the first start is acknowledging like truth telling, right? Like being able to think, and the way that I work, and I come from a lot of like, as a cultural justice advocate, a lot of my early career was built like in museums. And if we're talking about colonial institutions, like museums are one of the most colonial institutions that continually exacerbate and continually exploit Indigenous and people of color's culture for profit, right? And so I think that to be able to repair harm, we have to name it. We have to be able to say that this hurt, somebody hurt us, whether it was a community, whether it was a person. And in the consulting that I do, like there are times where, and we know, I'm sure we could all as panelists like think about, you know, people and institutions where there was one person on staff who harmed an auntie, a grandma, or a grandpa. And for that reason, the entire community lost faith and trust in that one institution, right? And so when we think about like harm, and we think about trying to repair that and work toward the fulfillment of equity and equality, we have to name it first. And sometimes I think that can be one of the hardest parts. But there's this really awesome just person I'm always inspired by. His name is Brian Stevenson. And one of the things that, one of his quotes, like we always want to work toward like reconciliation, like as the good part, right? Like all of, like we can name things of like this, that's going to feel so good, but you can only get there until you tell the truth, until all of that harm is like named and worked through. And so I think when we're looking at like, how do we repair and build toward equity in organizations, it is naming that. It's being able to say like, we don't have Indigenous, you know, people who are making decisions, you know, in this organization, you know. And I've been in museums where we have had, quite a few Indigenous people on staff, but if I'm the only one at the table in the boardroom with senior managers, like that's not a lot of representation, right? It doesn't, what does that mean? And so we have to be able to name it. We have to be able to like say, not from like a numbers perspective, but just like we need more representation, both inside the organization and outside, to be able to like have people engaged, to have like accountability partners. Those things matter. Like to have elder and residencies that are paid, right? Like to have all of the Indigenous knowledge and perspective that we're asking for support to like build relevance of our organization, like on our behalf. Like all of that is labor and it needs to also be paid. And that's also part of like truth telling, is also naming that our ancestors and our community members have continuously gone through places and worked with places for free for decades, for generations. And that's a harm, right? Like we need to also name those things too. So I think it's like both and all of the above at the same time, you know, in a way that is working toward how are we like shifting perspectives, and how are we really trying to have multiple narratives and not just uplift the single narrative that has been told and been played before. And so I think that the question that Katrina brings in the chat, like how do those who are not Indigenous help with making sure you get representation and support? I think if you're a member of an institution or you're a member of a park or you're supporting in some way where you're contributing, you can advocate, you can ask the institution, if in the instance, if it's a museum or a nonprofit, you can ask them, well, I'm really curious about the Indigenous people that you have in decision-making positions. What does that look like? What is the engagement? Which ways are you giving back to the Indigenous communities that you're from, that are homeland communities for where your institution sits? Like, you can propose ideas like land tax. You can ensure that they're giving land acknowledgements, that they're also like moving toward engaging in other actions that are happening in that community. I think all of those things are really critical. And I'm going to hand it over to Ty.
Thank you very much, Ty.
Thank you, ladies. Yeah, that was one of the first things I remember learning in school. When you give a speech, don't start with The thing, listening to both your stories, Michaela and Jacqueline, and the connecting the dots that you guys are doing by way of, where you're from and how that all plays out. It's definitely moving, and we're in a different time right now, and I don't know exactly what that is, and I'm not going to try to profess to be some kind of expert that understands it all, but I'm trying to think of like what was foretold, before, and even in some of our prophecies and things of the past, there was a foretelling of, these times of change were going to come, and it was going to be very devastating, and it was going to be very hurtful to the people, the land in itself, and really all of life. And I see where we're at today, and I try to keep putting my head and wrap my mind around where are we exactly, And we're talking about, as you were mentioning here earlier, Jacqueline, inclusion, equity, equality, and it feels comforting, I guess, to know that different perspectives are actually feeling like they have a seat at the table, a voice and a say in, how things should be maybe shaped going forward. And, you posed this question here, Gerard, how do we take, and I wrote it down as this: how do we take Indigenous knowledge into the national park system, and on the management side of things? And I think the shift is about, if I had to really kind of think about it in a sense, I don't know what to call it exactly, but I'm just going to kind of say, we're at some sort of a shift. And I don't like using the word polarization because it seems too conflicting, and it seems like there's a divide and a separation there, and there's two opposing forces, that are fighting. And I don't want to look at it in that way. I'm trying to think, how do we do this and stay similar to what we're doing out here in the urban setting? How do we navigate both of these worlds simultaneously with a sense of integrity at the same time? And not easy, and one of the things I've noticed too is that, especially in a setting like Ohio, it's very easy to present as such, to pass oneself off as, the authentic, genuine Native American, and one can play the role and act the part and throw a few lines out there, and you could have who knows how many people eating out of your hands if you like. But I think one of the things that we're missing a lot of times is that sense of authenticity, genuineness, integrity, and just, these good solid virtues that, really were second nature to who our people were at one point in time. And, I like to summarize it just with, honor and respect. I think if you really begin to look at those words and meditate on those for a minute, you can begin to really think that there's a lot more at hand that we can do. One, starting with ourselves, and then emanating that out, the family, community, and out into the universe. But don't want to get all philosophical here, but I like what you said, Gerard, earlier, and it really got me thinking that, we have to be careful on what we say. And I remember hearing that too growing up, that, there was this caution of don't give away too much of yourself, and you might live to regret that. And our history and our past has shown us so many things by way of how our people have been wronged in this world. And and I've heard it told, by a number of different tribes and peoples and cultures, that what we have left is what little that we've hidden, and we've had to take some of these things underground. And we know of our ceremonies that had to be conducted way far away, out in the dark, out of sight of anybody, and we tried to keep what we had alive. And we have these stories too, where our people hid in the mountains, where we're from, and they, preserve these things. And when I think about that, and then I think about the question that you pose, how do we bring this type of knowledge into the setting? It's how do I want to say, it's a challenge in itself, because the powers that be definitely have the final say. The dominant culture has definitely shaped the way that our history's gone at this point in time. But like I say, I feel like we're at a point of time of change. And I think what's really the question at hand that's begging to be asked is, how do we define who we really are, though? Because we have a lot of people, and it's unfortunate to say this, but if we're going to be honest and we're going to be open about things and put real things on the table, we have a lot of our own that are misrepresenting who we really are. And I think that we have to look at, on our side of it, if we're going to have positions, or we're going to have seats available, or if we're going to have places where we should have champions in there, our champions, then they should be vetted, or they should be backed, or there should be some sort of protocol in place to where one understands and knows that whatever this man, this woman is saying here by way of their people, where they're from, is understood in that same light too. They're not speaking out of turn. They're not overstepping their bounds. So I think that a part of bringing that knowledge in is, I think that there has to be a sense of genuineness to that, and realism within all of that too. But I really do like the idea, that we do need to think in terms of change and making a difference. And I just want to share a quick piece here, because the reason I want to speak this way is I used to do some work out of DC for a while, and I was contracted in over there for a few different years. And what I felt like I was witnessing sometimes, and I hate to say this, but it just kind of feels like sometimes I felt the positions that were earmarked, or designated to be, native specific, or, indigenous focused, or anything like that. Sometimes I felt like the way that DC operated was they were quick to just find the first token Native American they could to fulfill that role or that obligation. And honestly, I felt at times that it was more harm than good, because I didn't think that maybe that person, and this is my judgment, of course, but I would hear it from others as well, that I don't know if they're the right voice to represent who we are, So I just want to say it like that, So when you talk about bringing our people, our knowledge, I would hope that proper representation would be thought of first, and you would hear from the consensus of our Native people that, yeah, we deem that person, that type of, qualified to stand in that type of a role, and to advocate and to speak to these matters and issues at hand. So I'll say about that much. Thank you.
That's great, Ty. Thank you very much. And I think with that in mind also, is one thing I would encourage people to do if you have an opportunity, is to take this conversation to management. Take this conversation to the park superintendent, if you're in a National Park Service scene, or maybe if you're outside by a park, and have lunch with the superintendent and talk about these things. And I think that's that, and put him on the spot, or put him or her on the spot. I think Ty, you made a great example, and I'll share that with everybody. When I became the assistant director of the National Park Service, it was really interesting, because the first day of walking into the office at Interior in DC, I was all alone. I walked in there was nobody there to greet me. There was nobody there to say, hey, this is what you're doing now. And I stood there and I remember standing in the hallway and looking around and saying, holy crap, the hell I do this for? But I noticed that that from then on, then we had to get to work. Then we had to get busy. And so maybe with this is a great discussion. I wish we can keep it going, but we can in our own individual parks, in our own individual management systems, keep it going with everybody. We're at the point now, unfortunately, where I guess we open it up for questions. And there was a couple more questions that they're on my list, but we'll have to keep on going with questions now. And so let me see what I got here. Can people see the questions on your screen?
In the Q&A, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the Q&A.
Yeah. Yes.
We can see the Q&A, yes.
Okay, if you can see that, if anybody wants to grab one and let's go that way, because I'm having a hard time with mine. So what is it?
The first one reads, as a non-decision maker, non-Indigenous employee of a nonprofit working to raise funds for a park, what are ways we might be able to make connections with members of the Indigenous communities to help build a more equitable, inclusive action plan for our organization?
Great. You want to just keep on going with that one, Michaela?
Ooh. Why are you doing that? Like, okay, honestly, people come into our community all the time with good intentions. They want to help, but they also walk in with their perspective of what is being helpful. And it sometimes comes across like savior mentality a little bit. Like sometimes people want to fix things that aren't actually broken, not to us anyways, but from the outside, it looks like, it looks like dysfunctional or something like that, or they're misinterpreting data. So I'll give you an example. We get people that come to Molokai, organizations meaning well, and they say, well, you have such high statistics in people on welfare, unemployment, like they're looking at all these things and they say, you need job training and you need so that we can get you employment and, maybe like food assistance or something like that. But if you actually look at the why, the truth is we don't have adequate childcare and we have no long-term healthcare facilities for the elderly. And so competent, smart, able-bodied adults need to pull themselves out of the workforce to stay home and take care of their babies and their elders, because they're the only ones who can keep track of things and physically do this work. And so supporting that, like, you know what I mean? Like the response isn't more job training, it's help us with senior care or help us with childcare and resources in other places. So I'm just saying that engage your community, have the conversations, and don't walk in going, what can we raise money? We want to do these things. And start the conversation is, how can we help you? Instead of, does that make sense? Like flipping the script or the order in which things happen?
Yes.
Jacqueline, Ty, you guys, do you experience that in your communities?
Oh yeah, completely. I think that, one of the things that, like, I guess like my pro tips are always like, you need to think about cultivating relationships, not just building relationships, right? So not starting from like, here's the solution I think that would be helpful, like to your people, to your organization, to your family, to XYZ, but really like, how are we like being in relationship with each other from a deep place and understanding? And I think that that's something that is generative. One of my favorite quotes, or another one of my favorite quotes is from the just incredible like Black woman, Adrienne Marie Brown, who says like moving at the speed of trust, right? And so recognizing that there are moments when the solutions that you think need to happen, particularly in Indigenous communities or communities of color, are ones that are going to take a long time they will move at the speed of trust. And like I've added on to that quote, like you can only move as fast as your least trusting partner, right? And so I always caution people that if you go or in working with a community and you get to a place of like everyone saying like, yes, that's a great idea. Yes, that's a great idea. Yes, 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 yes. Like if there are too many yeses, I'm always like cautious of that. I think sometimes you have to be in a place of like, especially working in place from the perspective of having worked at museums. I know that one of the tactics has been to go back to the same advisors. Well, what, like if there's a controversy of some sort, going back to the same advisor to say, hey, like this came up, and the reason why they would always approach that particular person is because that person was like, oh no, that's fine. Like, you know, treats it from a way of like giving permission on behalf of all people, which is kind of what you touched on too, right? Like we have to be cognizant of just not putting Indigenous people or people of color in positions where they're speaking on behalf of an entire community, right? Like I want critical thought, I want critique, that's what I'm looking for, is like to move at the speed of trust for me means that I'm making a holistic decision. I'm thinking about harm that may happen. I'm thinking about what good or healing might come from this. And sometimes there are trade-offs, like working in institutions, like they are colonial spaces, and we have to acknowledge that too. And so I think that that's something that we have to recognize, that it also, this work is hard, to be in that place. I use the word of a translator, to be in that translator space of like working in between Indigenous communities and nonprofit or institutions. But we have to recognize that like we're not doing this work of like fulfilling Indigenous sovereignty by ourselves, right? Like there are protectors like on the front lines. There are people and health workers that are healing. There are medicine people that are saying prayers. And all of that collective like movement is working toward that fulfillment too. And I think sometimes we have to take the pressure off of ourselves to like try to fix everything. And that's not realistic, right? We have to be able to move, understanding that we are moving in like tandem and rhythm with our communities too.
Great, thank you. Ty, any thoughts?
Yeah, ditto, I concur with the ladies. I think in reality, I think just we see this so much out here too. And whoever asked this question, I'm not trying to make it out like, this is the third part of any kind of an attack toward you. I think people need to understand too, though, that there's a current context at hand. And I think sometimes that's not really acknowledged early on. And I like the way that you put that, going at the speed of trust. And that is an awesome expression, because I feel that that's what we're all trying to figure out, especially when, and I keep referencing back to Ohio, and to me, this is a world away from where I grew up, but out here, we have to proceed with caution, and we have to take steps, and oftentimes it kind of sucks, but we have to be looking over our shoulder for certain things too. But I would say just come in. There's a lot of great non-native, allies and champions and friends and people that are in our corners. And honestly, as an agency for us just out here, I just speak for us, but I can imagine I speak for others too, telling a little bit of their story, but we wouldn't have gotten to where we are today. We've had great, awesome people that are non-native that have just helped, lay the foundation, pave the way going forward, a lot of great things. But I think one thing too is early on, what I try to tell people is just kind of let go of what you think you might have an understanding about, because it might not really play into the context of where things are today. So, it's okay to say, I don't know what I don't know, and to come in and then to ask the question first, like, where is the need? Where is the concern? And I can reference to some work that we did here. We did thorough, very comprehensive needs assessment over a 3-year period, a project that we just dove into, you know, all the way, both feet and everything. And what emerged from that was, you know, that culture was super important to our people. Community was, you know, at the utmost highest of importance too, right next to culture. And we thought we understood these things, but when we began to unpack it and look at it, and mind you, I'm speaking from the native side of it, but we had to look at this and recognize that there was numerous intertribal interpretations of what this meant to each and every tribal representation that exists amongst our community. And so, you know, hence there's a learning curve there for us as well, you know. And if I'm going to be humble and honest about things too, you know, I have to say, I don't know what I don't know either, you know. So I just, you know, ask when people come in and they want to be a part of things, and granted their hearts are in the right place and their initiatives are really about, you know, trying to propel our people forward and for the betterment of our future, you know, that's all fine and well. But honestly, a lot of times there's already a lot of initiatives at hand, and we're already got a lot of irons in the fire, and we're wearing a lot of hats already. And so I'd ask, you know, when people approach that, they just be mindful and be respectful enough to think of those things as they come towards us, and offering a hand of help and, you know, support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're getting out of time. And I want to thank the panelists. What an excellent dialogue and conversation and thoughts to get us all thinking about different things. And I would like to have this conversation go on forever. And I think we can do that. I think we can do that. What we need to do again is I challenge everybody, and there's some great people out here from some beautiful tribes all across America and Hawaii and up in the Alaskan country that have wrote in. We really appreciate that. But let's keep this conversation going, and let's, as I said, let's challenge ourselves to try to get to see what the National Park Service is doing. And if you're outside the park areas, come on in, I believe, in a way, and start visiting with the parks. Let's get more involved in it. There's organizations within the Park Service, I believe, that are starting to get organized to help us out as far as even hiring capabilities. And we need to press those over and over again. So again, I want to thank everybody. What a beautiful conversation we had. What interesting areas that came up. And again, I challenge you to bring that into the management of the National Park Service. I don't care if it's in parks, it's in regional offices, it's in a national office in Interior, but let's keep that conversation going. That's the only way we're going to do things. That's the only way that we can make sure things happen. And the way we do it, I believe, in a way, because what we all said tonight is, again, to remind you, all of us, to get our youth involved as much as possible, so they learn the national parks. If you look at the national parks, it's the same philosophies as we learned as American Indian children, Native children, from our elders, as far as respect for the land, as I started out, respect for the land, and definitely respect for ourselves and respect for others. So at this time, I want to thank everybody from the bottom of my heart. Thank my panelists. You guys are excellent. I can sit here and listen to you guys for days, and I hope I can. So at this time, I believe the time is up now. So everybody have a nice evening, and keep the dialogue going, please. Keep the dialogue going. Thank you.